So to kick us off, it would be great to hear a little bit about your path kind of from Stanford all the way through A16Z, and throughout that, if you could comment on timing. You talked about this a little bit when we met on Friday, and then what are some of the decisions you've made that were kind of contrarian during your career? Like, what's your framework in terms of pursuing the things you work on?
So I would describe my career arc in one phrase, which was 10 years too early. So right after Stanford, I went to a company trying to build the iPhone. This was in the late Stone Age, I won't date myself, but early 90s. And we were literally trying to build the iPhone, 640 by 480, 1 pixel on or off. Modems were, the fastest modems were 28K, right? This was if you want to read the book about this company, which was called Go, Jerry Kaplan wrote the book. It's called Startup. This is one of the storied Silicon Valley implosions. Raised $100 million, and ultimately we were too early. I went straight from that to Oracle, and most people don't know this because Oracle's famous for databases and application software, but Oracle tried to build Netflix in 1994, which is to say it tried to build a streaming service that would allow you to watch movies and then buy what was in those movies. And at the time, it was sort of a death battle between Oracle and SGI, two of the iconic Silicon Valley companies, and we were trying to sell to the telcos a service. In fact, BT was one of our customers, but 1994 was way too early for this. You could not buy a Sun, or you could barely buy an SGI machine that could stream, because today, streaming is easy. There are MPEG-4 transcoders and encoders and decoders. You have one in your pocket in the iPhone. Back then, it was all done in software, and so we had to use supercomputers to stream, and that made the economics not work. And then from that, I went to Netscape, which was my one break in timing, which was this was the perfect time to try to disrupt client-server software with this thing called the internet. Ben Horowitz, the Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, was my first good manager, I like to say, at Netscape. I had one before that, which I won't name. Perfect time, right? And it's amazing to me, sort of, here we are, 2018, and we're just now getting into the age where the internet really has transformed everything, right? It takes a generation, right? We were toiling away in sort of the mid-90s, but now it's a thing, right? Back then, it wasn't clear it was going to be a thing. In fact, I remember very vividly, I worked on the security team for a couple years. The New York Times ran an article saying there was this obscure bug in our crypto implementation of SSL. And the article in the New York Times literally said, nobody will ever buy anything on the internet because of this weird bug. And that was the lead story of the New York Times, right? Which is, it's amazing to sort of think about. And I love the stories of nobody will buy X on the internet and how X has changed over the years, and it's been wrong every time. Nobody will buy CDs, nobody will buy clothes, nobody will buy furniture, nobody will buy shoes on the internet. And like, look, you're gonna buy everything on the internet. There will be nothing that you're not buying on the internet, which is awesome. After Netscape, I went to a consumer company called Respond.com. Now here's stuff you're still not buying on the internet, which is services and hard to find products, right? Which is if you want a plumber or a wedding photographer or a videographer or a real estate agent in general, you're still not buying that on the internet. You're still getting referrals, or you're asking your neighbors. And so one day you will buy those things on the internet, but we were a little too early. I could tell we were a little too early because my number one feature request, I was the head of product and UI design at this company, was, hey, it's awesome that you're finding people who want my service. Can you fax me the lead? So that was my sign. It was a little too early. After Respond.com, which was the name of this company, I reconnected with Mark and Ben, who at the time were starting LoudCloud. For those of you that have not read the book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, that's what that book is about. And most business books are kind of a victory lap. You look back and sort of say, look how awesome that was. And The Hard Thing About Hard Things, if you read it, you know it's not about that. It's about, there were 1,000 times we nearly died. Let me tell you about 70 of them. Right, and Ben was very candid. And let me just tell you, as somebody who sort of worked there almost the entire duration, it was much worse than that book made it out to be. It felt like we were going to die every other day. And I often joke, like, startups, this is what startups are like as potential founders. We're going to rule the world. We're dead. It's over. We're screwed. There's no way. We're going to rule the world. It's dead. We're over. We can't raise our next money. And then you have lunch. Okay, so that's startup life, right? And that's what Live Cloud was like. It turns out that you can't build Amazon Web Services, which is what we were trying to do, without a critical piece of software plumbing called the hypervisor. VMware grew up sort of parallel to us, and so we were a little too early. But we like to think that we sort of influenced Amazon into sort of being the behemoth that it is by saying you're going to rent all of your compute and storage and stuff on the cloud, which was great. HP ended up buying our company, and after the 18-month lockup, we all basically started Andreessen Horowitz. Mark and went fundraising in the spring of 2009, which, if you might recall, was sort of like the nuclear winter of fundraising. Everybody was sort of hoarding their cash because the world was coming to an end financially. But Mark and Ben, being Mark and Ben, managed to raise a fund, and we've been open for business ever since then, summer of 2009, trying to find the world's great entrepreneurs. So I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. So speaking about being too early, you've seen kind of infrastructure shift from in-house to cloud, and now there's a promise, maybe on a TV show, of a decentralized internet. Where do you think we actually are for a version of Pied Piper in the real world, and where does it leave VCs?
Yeah, so we've seen basically 3 platform shifts since we started, so 9 years. These things don't happen that often. So one platform shift was on-premise to cloud. So at one point, it was counterintuitive to start a cloud-first company. In fact, I remember when Databricks started, and they said, we're going to be cloud only, we're not going to be on-prem. We were like, I'm not sure that's the right strategy. And it's turned out great for them, and so it was sort of the right time. Another big platform shift was mobile first, which at one point it was risky to start a company and not basically build the desktop web version first and start with mobile. It was counterintuitive, and then it flipped. Then AI first is probably sort of the latest incarnation of that, which is we're AI first, and at one point that was meaningful and you were differentiated, and then at some point it's like, what do you mean you don't have AI algorithms? What do you mean you're not doing deep learning or machine learning? Like, 2 companies being equal, doing the same thing, one with, one without machine learning, guess which one gets funded? Guess which one will build together software? Guess which one will delight their customer, right? It's obviously the one sort of with AI. And so those are the big 3 platform shifts. The one that we're in the middle of right now, and we're in the very early days of it, is sort of cryptocurrency and the incentive systems built around crypto. One of the ways that we can tell when something is happening, there's a phenomenon, here's the way to think about it, which is, how big and secure a job are you giving up to go do a startup in that area? Okay, so there was a winter in cryptocurrencies where basically nobody was giving up jobs, right? You had to be crazy and you weren't giving up that much. These days, people at Facebook and Google and the big companies are basically giving up $5 to $10 to $15 million guaranteed money in the form of RSUs to go start these companies. So that gives you a sense of sort of the level of ambition and sort of the ecosystem that is forming around cryptocurrencies. And our belief is that with enough talent going out to build these raw protocols and the game theory concepts that will incent behavior in the systems, we're going to get the next generation internet. Which is to say, if you think about our investments in Facebook and Twitter and Lyft and Airbnb, if there is going to be a disruptor to all of those companies, it will come on the back of cryptocurrencies, right? Which is Facebook amasses all of this attention, and then they can charge advertisers to get to my attention. The thinking is, if Nike wants my attention, why don't I sell it to them directly? If that is a future in which we live, there will probably be a cryptocurrency that mediates that transaction where I sell my attention to Nike, and that's basically what we're investing in right now, which is we're laying the plumbing for it. So if you wanted to flash back to sort of internet time and draw the analogy, we're inventing TCP/IP and HTTP and FTP right now. Out of that will come Netscape, and later Facebook, and later Airbnb. But right now we're inventing the fundamental building blocks that will allow us to do things like identity and payments and how do I distribute compute and all of that stuff. So we're actively investing in the protocol layer. If you sort of think about that for the internet, the protocol makers didn't make any money, right? So there are famous people who invented all of these protocols. There's Wikipedia pages for all of them, but very few of them became wealthy. And so the idea behind crypto is maybe we can actually help make a generation of people who not only do technical innovation, but can benefit from it financially as well. So super popular these days.
So a big part of our thesis at EF is about backing technologists and saying actually something that in the Valley is extremely obvious, but maybe historically less so in Europe, which is some of the best founders are tech founders. They're people with deep tech backgrounds. And so that inevitably means that a lot of EF's outputs end up being deep tech, which really over the last 4 or 5 years has meant a heavy machine learning component, as you've already talked about. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit and maybe say something about how you see, kind of now that everyone is AI first, what does that mean for what kinds of startups can win? I mean, we've seen a few, very good friends with the guys up the road at DeepMind, which is sort of a horizontal AI company. We've not really seen anything very exciting since then. Everything seems to be vertical. Is that going to stay the same? Is that going to change? What are you seeing now that's exciting in that space?
Yeah, I wrote this blog post about 18 months ago, and it was titled, "In 2 years, nobody's going to be looking for AI startups," right? And at the time that I wrote it, it was sort of like, what? He's lost his mind. I had a partner write sort of the end of cloud computing, Peter Levine, sort of same thing, which is, look, AI is going to get into every single application that we write, and it'll be mandatory part of the set of computer science techniques you put into all of your software, right? It's not going to be AI or not AI. Of course, you're going to have AI. And so what we're looking for now is the vertical companies, because the platform companies are going to have what we think is a stranglehold on the platforms. And let me come back. So let's put a bookmark on that, and I'll explain why we think the horizontal companies will have a hard time. So we're looking for the vertical companies. And my advice to people who are building these vertical AI companies is, let me express it this way. If you have a deck where you're doing fundraising, you have a choice about how much to budget to each of your sections. And on one section, you can talk about the fantastic recurrent neural networks that you've built into the thing that leads to look at this area under the curve, it's beautiful, right? One slide, no more, right? The temptation is to have that be 15 slides, and here's the novel technique, and here's how this area in the curve is fantastic, and look at the false positive rate, and here's a novel architecture. The problem with that is that's not the hard part. And I'm not discounting the awesomeness of the technology, but technologies like AutoML, where we're going to automatically search the architecture space of neural networks, is going to make that less of a differentiator. On the other side, and spend a lot of slides on this, is how do I bottle up this technology and take it to market? How do I solve enough of a problem to command enough of a price so that I can afford the go-to-market motion that I need to sell my product? And so this spend a lot of time on, right? Because we see, even in Silicon Valley, this is where a lot of companies fall down, which is my price isn't high enough to afford the go-to-market motion, right? And it's not intuitive for an entrepreneur to think that my price needs to be high enough to afford a sales motion, but that's the whole, that's the difference between having a business and not having a business, which is if you can't afford to tell your salesperson. So here's a question that don't let the investor stump you on this question, which is, what is OTE for your salespeople? So first, what is OTE? On target earnings. That is what you pay your salesperson when they make their quota. What is a quota, right? Well, that is how much they need to sell in a year of your software. And basically, there's a direct line between what they need to make and how much you can charge for your software, and make sure all of that pencils out, right? So spend a lot of time as an entrepreneur convincing yourself, and the best way to convince yourself that you command the value that you believe you get is a PO. It's not metrics. Metrics are great, but show me the PO, right? Purchase order for those that don't sell it to enterprise. And just make sure that you've got a straight line connect the value that I can command with my awesome machine learning technology and what I can afford to pay a sales and marketing team to go scalably unlock that.
Awesome. I suppose kind of final thing on technologies from me, maybe Bart has another one, is I'd love to hear a little bit more about the GitHub story. I mean, that's obviously been very much in the news recently. I think I remember reading at the time when you guys led a Series A into that lots of people said was a sign of runaway inflation, could never work, and obviously it's been a pretty exciting few weeks on that front. But I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit about that story, but also about what it means more broadly that a company like that can become so valuable.
Yeah, that's a great question. People thought we had lost our minds on the GitHub valuation because we were the first money in. It was a big check. It was our biggest check, Series A check of the time, at a very high valuation. People also thought that about Skype. So thank you, Microsoft, in both cases. for proving that we were not complete idiots. Here's what I think sort of GitHub says about the software community and sort of investing in general. So the old way to build value in enterprise companies was as follows. You build a technology, you get a couple customers, and then you hire a Mercedes driving, Rolex wearing set of salespeople to go sell the value to a CIO. The CIO buys your product at $1 million, so I'm thinking Oracle, I'm thinking SAP, that era of company. And they basically declare it an industry standard, and they force everybody in their organization, whether they like it or not, to deploy that technology. That way of building a company no longer works. The new way of building that exact same company is that you open source something. You jump in front of the parade that results from you open sourcing company, where people just use that tech. And you get adoption inside an organization so that by the time you hire a salesperson to land in that account, there's already 12, 15, 20 teams using it. And your salesperson's responsibility is basically to get the enterprise roll-up deal. In other words, how much will you charge them for all you can eat because they don't want to pay the per seat price? Okay? So Slack is also like this, right? Like they didn't open source anything, but like that thing just, everybody was using Slack, right? It was the thing. And so basically the old way, enterprise salesperson winning Gartner Magic Quadrant, right, is no longer the way it's done. And so bottoms up adoption from developers who have budget and sway for the first time, right? Because it used to all be IT's money. Now it's software engineering. And why software engineering? Because somebody smart, I once wrote an editorial for the Wall Street Journal, software is eating the world, right? Which is every company has become a software company. Therefore, the importance of the software developer is the highest it's ever been in our ecosystem. And therefore, a sales process that starts with an engineer making a decision on an open source project or making a decision on an API, that's sort of the way that you get to build these big companies, which is win adoption, have the salesperson get to ride that momentum by the time that they arrive, and that's the new way. By the way, flashing back to Netscape days, because I'm old now, I get to tell the old people's stories. The way we built the browser business, believe it or not, we sold the browser in the early days of Netscape, was very similar, which is people wanted to surf the internet. And they found our browser, they downloaded it. And as a sales strategy, the first call to a big company would be into the legal office, right? Literally the general counsel, saying, hey, did you know that there are 12,262 people at your organization using Netscape? And you're in violation of a software license. And that opened a lot of doors from a sales point of view. So get usage, send somebody to collect the value, actually worked for Netscape, and it is sort of the new pattern for building an enterprise software company.
So related to GitHub, do you have a kind of thesis or outlook as to what will be the next generation of developer tools or community? On Friday, you alluded to kind of training data workflow, but what are you looking for in San Francisco in terms of things to enable developers to the next level of productivity?
Yeah, so a very interesting shift is happening. So there will be more stuff. We haven't completely retooled the tool chain for sort of modern development, right? So we grew up sort of waterfall. We release software once a year. We went from that to agile, where we do weekly stand-ups. And so the tool transformation is not yet complete. So there are a couple more things that will sort of fall in that space. Meanwhile, this AI ML thing is creating a completely different way to program computers. So in the history of computer programming, it's basically been sort of increasing levels of abstraction and productivity on writing if-then-else rules, right? So literally from machine language all the way to sort of Python Django, it's more efficiency on the if-then-else rules. Machine learning, especially the supervised learning techniques, is basically about labeling data. And so a completely new chain, right, a new compiler, a new debugger, a new set of productivity tools is emerging on this side, where the labeling tools get to approach the complexity of Photoshop. So if you have ever seen Uber's tools where Uber engineers are labeling situations, right? Here's a picture of a street. Here are the lanes. Here are the curbs. Here's a bicyclist. Here's a flower pot. Like that thing has 20 icons on it. It has 20 icons and a 400-page manual of here are the rules for interpreting the scene, because we need everybody to do it consistently. And then think about I made a change to that rule. What do I do with all the old labels? Maybe all the old labels are now suspicious, or I need to go back, or I need to relabel them. And so think about a tool chain emerging on this side of completely new way of programming, which is I'm doing it from the data up rather than from the logic down. And so over the next, call it 5-10 years, expect this tool chain for software development, which is sort of the first big break since we've had from the original von Neumann machines that's happened. And there's going to be very sophisticated software that powers the labelers.
So shifting away slightly from trends to more company building, I think what EF does phenomenally well is bring teams together. So maybe you can speak a little bit about what you view as a kind of cohesive, complementary team and kind of some characteristics that you've seen time and time again.
Yeah, so this is a very broad question, but a couple things to look for, which is co-founders are super important, and EF is running this very vital experiment in the ecosystem that says we're going to fund people even if they don't have a co-founder yet, or come find your co-founder here, right? And so that's a super interesting experiment because finding your co-founder is one of the most important decisions that you'll ever make, right? And so rookie mistake in finding a co-founder is to not have enough complementary skill sets and perspectives. Right? If you come in looking for somebody that looks and talks and acts just like you might think, aha, that's fantastic because we see eye to eye. We don't have arguments. We don't, right? The nuanced way to think about it is you've got to have arguments. If you don't have arguments, you don't have enough of a complementary skill set. And the whole point of a startup team is to be able to see the same problem from multiple points of view. So what you're looking for is not somebody that you won't argue with. What you're looking for is somebody that you can argue super effectively with, right? Ben and Mark remind me of this. Read the book. Ben got this very spicy, profanely laced email from Mark late one night after Mark had sort of leaked this big product announcement that Ben had been planning for months. So go read that story. The point of it is they fight awesome. In other words, they can just completely disagree with each other. They don't take it personally. And they can figure out how to get to a resolution. And once they get to a resolution, we call it sort of commit and agree or disagree and commit. But the point is we're taking a course of action after so when you're looking for your co-founders, that's what you're looking for. And then by extension, this is sort of the rest of your company, right? This is the rest of the design, which is, do I have enough perspectives on the table? Do I have a way that we can get into ferocious yelling matches, but half an hour after it's over, we've disagreed and committed to a strategy, right? So that's my general advice on sort of looking for teams. It's not we see eye to eye. It's we can have great fights, but we know how to resolve them.
Awesome. I think probably we should soon open up to the floor, but one kind of last question from me, and seems relevant given that you're here in London, is sort of, what's your perspective on how the global startup ecosystem is evolving? I mean, for a long time, kind of the joke about Silicon Valley VCs was, if they couldn't walk to the founder's office, then it's quite a long way away. You're here in London, presumably not for the weather. We see more and more Silicon Valley VCs come here. As you know, we have an office in Singapore. We're seeing more and more US, Chinese, Indian investors at our demo days there. How do you see, kind of this globalization of VC? Is it a real thing? Is it going to carry on?
So first, I like to think I brought the sun from California. You're welcome. Beautiful 2 weeks in London. Look, the world is getting flat on entrepreneurship, and there is no one region that has a monopoly on all of the great talent, which is why 500 Startups, why EF, there are all of these organizations around the world that are training a community, building an ecosystem. The nice thing about ecosystems that are at scale is that here's the easiest way to think about why Silicon Valley works for startups and why Hollywood works for movies, which is middle managers, right? Middle managers, you usually think of sort of, they get the short shrift, right? They're sort of the intermediaries. But if you're starting a company, sort of having people who have done something similar is extremely valuable. So that's one thing that's valuable at ecosystem at scale. And the other is what I call sort of the Roger-Bannister effect, which is, wow, I didn't know you could go that fast, right? Until he ran that mile, and then like everybody could run the mile fast or faster, right? It's sort of like I didn't know you could get that big an outcome. So those are the two benefits from an ecosystem at scale. But look, there's no monopoly that says Silicon Valley is the only ecosystem where that is going to take place. So efforts like this to sort of bootstrap an ecosystem and get enough players in it so there are enough talented middle managers, there's enough people with big outcomes to sort of serve as the Roger Bannister-esque role models, that's fantastic. And that's why I come, that's why other people come. I would say, if you look at the world around us, let me use an analogy that people who live in London might appreciate. So Silicon Valley has been the fastest train on the track for a while. If there is one train that makes us go, that could be happening faster, it's China. Which is to say, have you heard 996 as a description of the work week in China? So that is 9 a.m., 9 p.m., 6 days a week, 996. And what is 996? 996 is you are being lazy, because 997 is what's happening, right? So the intensity of China's work ethic, the completeness of the STEM training are two critical ingredients. I think the big open question is whether that ecosystem has enough failure in it to create durable outcomes. And by failure, I mean really investors who will lose their pants on companies as opposed to later investors or government entities propping those things up. Because if you're trying to create a durable company, you need more failures than successes, because you need the system to basically say, you know, that experiment, it failed, we're moving on. What you don't want is a system that says, I don't want this thing to fail, so we're going to put another round into it and another round and another round. And if you look sort of outside of venture financing in China and you look at sort of just global, you know, real estate investing, that type of thing, there's a little too much propping happening up, right? So they've got a couple of the key ingredients. They've got a work ethic, they've got intensity, they've got STEM training, they've got ambition. The question now is whether they're put into a system that will allow enough failure so that genuine successes come out of it, as opposed to fake successes.
So before we open up to questions, we thought we'd do a quick rapid fire, first starting long or short. So Microsoft?
I'm long Microsoft. I think Satya, I can't imagine somebody doing a better job of Microsoft. The culture is transformed. The strategy is clear. Like, this is not your father's Microsoft anymore. This is SQL Server on Linux rented through Azure, right? This is Windows not being a product group anymore. Satya's literally told the Windows product group, look, you're going to get it rented through Azure, but you're competing with Linux, so it better be better. And I'm not propping you up anymore. It's unbelievable what's happening inside Microsoft.
So you may be slightly biased, but the kind of e-scooters phenomenon.
Haha, I'm long scooters. So we're investors in this company called Lime. By the way, Chinese entrepreneurs that make some of the companies in our portfolio look like they're going slow, and we have high intensity entrepreneurs. Look, every city is going to go through a period of angst, but between self-driving cars, self-driving buses, and scooters that you can, this is the future of getting from place A to place B, right? It's only a matter of working out the details of the regulation as opposed to, is this the right solution? It's part of the right solution, for sure.
So final quick fire thing, pick one, VR or AR in terms of value created?
AR in the long term, probably VR in the short.
Bitcoin or Ethereum?
Ethereum. Distributed applications for the win.
Final one before the floor, Amazon or Alibaba?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Both are good in their ecosystems, and I think there will be very little crossover. And so it's a hedge, right? I don't expect Alibaba to be hugely successful in the West, and I don't expect Amazon to be hugely successful in sort of China and Greater China, and they are both enormous markets.
Awesome. Well, we'll now open up to the floor for questions. So if you raise your hands if you want to ask, I will bring this microphone around because we do want people to be able to hear you. So I'll sort of start over here and then sort of work my way. I'm going to start at the back.
My question is that if an entrepreneur were to fail because he's too early in tech, so what would be your advice to him? What should he do next?
Get up and try again is sort of the short answer. So one of the things that makes Silicon Valley work, and I think this should be adopted for anybody who's trying to bootstrap a tech ecosystem, is here's sort of the spectrum. We can treat people who have failed with their companies as failures. They're unhireable. Like people will ask you during an interview cycle, why did you fail, right? There are those ecosystems, right? You don't have to go far. And then there's people who think that is awesome that they failed. We like to joke, maybe we should start Z Combinator, which is to take every Y Combinator founder that failed and just give them money, right? And the intuition behind that, because on one hand, it's like completely counterintuitive, right? Which is why would you take somebody who's like a known failure and give them money? Well, the idea is, look, they've learned a series of extremely valuable lessons on the back of some other investor's money. They'll never make those mistakes again, and you're just better off, right? And so my general advice to both ecosystems and entrepreneurs is, look, don't let failure define you. Just like if you make a set of mistakes, that doesn't make you a failure. It just makes you smarter for the next try.
Thanks a lot. Really interesting stuff in there. We're a EF company doing a lot of enterprise B2B sales, so naturally I want to dig into that a bit more. Big fan of your work, and Mark Cranny as well from A16Z. One question I had is the transition from open source sales models to, let's say, high margin PO commanding, end result. We see companies like Red Hat coming into the market, but usually they tend to focus on service to get those margins. How do you navigate that transition without losing too much value in the process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so let me start by sort of disagreeing respectfully with sort of the premise of the question, which is the premise of the question was, how do I transition from low margin open source or near free open source to sort of a high margin SaaS model? And the best companies will figure out how to do both concurrently, which is there is an open source component, maybe it's free, but you use that as marketing cost, right? So in the old days, what that money would have gone to is trade shows and marketing people to influence Gartner so that you're up and to the right in the magic quadrant. New companies basically invest all that money in open source and developer evangelism, which is to say, I have a dedicated either direct report to the CEO or very close to the CEO. All they do is try to get more developers to use it. So that means a lot of sample code. That means snappy videos that make the developers go, I want that, right? So think Twilio, think Stripe. It is no accident that developers got to use those APIs. There was a very deliberate and funded strategy to go after those developers, right? So one, you have to take that super seriously. And then two, you've got to figure out when they pay me, how do they pay me, right? And that should be a 90% gross margin business with all of the right features. And of course, it's sort of a challenge to keep ahead of the community, right? You have an open source community that wants to basically open source everything because that's sort of their incentives. And you've got to figure out, how do I stay in front of that with the right set of features? The easy thing to do on the right set of features for this is what I call the enterprise ilities. Scalability, reliability, right? So failover, that doesn't need to be an open source project. That can be in your enterprise project. Or role-based access control, right? It's all the super boring enterprise stuff, right? But enterprises like nothing more than say, you can do that, but you can't do that. That doesn't need to be in your open source project, right? So being smart about the ilities makes it a 90% gross margin product. And so you give away a little, but when you charge, you look like a normal software company.
Transitioning from really agile, everyone knows everything, small team, 15, 20 people, growing very fast, to 50, 100 people. How do you make that transition without losing that agility, that dynamism, that stuff that made you successful in the first place?
Yeah, that is a great question and super important to sort of navigating growth. So the techniques that got you to sort of 15 people, and then from 15 to call it sort of 75, right, and then 75 plus, they are completely different techniques. And as founders, you need to sort of recognize that different things happen at each one of those sort of transition points that you need to actively manage. So for instance, when you're about 75, 80 people, what happens, even if you're all in the same space, and this might have happened earlier if you're a distributed team like many European teams are, at 75, 80 people, not everybody knows everybody anymore. It just becomes physically impossible. Your brain does not have that much room for these social relationships. When that happens, your brain will take shortcuts. A shortcut of the form of those people in marketing, right? Because you know there's a group of people that are marketing, you just don't know everybody anymore. Or those customer support people. And when those sentences start getting said in your company, that is the beginnings of potential politics. That's the beginning of wedges. That's the beginning of friction. That's the beginning of all the things that you don't want that you had when you were 15 people. So you need to be aware of that, and you need to engineer your organization and your communication structures as a result. You might need a reorg. You definitely need one-on-ones. You definitely need pass-downs. You definitely need managers who care enough to start explaining and naming people by name in the other teams, in their team meetings, so that you don't lose that, right? But if the CEO doesn't enforce that, which is that the CEO is not doing it at their staff because they never needed to do it before, guess what? Your managers won't do it, and their managers won't do it. And pretty soon you have an organization that looks like the old Microsoft. Have you guys seen the org chart description of, they have like all these classic Silicon Valley companies and their org charts, and Microsoft's was depicted as an org chart where there's guns coming out of every node pointed at all the other nodes in the organization. That's what happens when people don't know everybody by name, right? You stop giving them the benefit of the doubt, you start lumping them together and making categorizations. And so as a founder, you've got to be sensitive to all of these things and just realize you have to reprogram your organization, which is to say its structure, its incentives, its communication paths every time. And when you hit that stage, that planning and that work as a CEO is even more important than your product work. Which is, if you're still deep in product work at that point and you're not seriously thinking about how do I engineer my organization and not my product, then you probably don't have the right complement, we were talking about this earlier, on your executive team, because you haven't been able to sort of let go of the product, and then meanwhile your culture will get out where you don't want it to be.
The main observed about technology is the fact that you constantly need to make decisions on the great uncertainty, and you always need the courage to do something that's never done before. So a lot of the times when you're at the moment you're making that decision, it seems completely crazy, and then in 5 years it's like, oh yeah, that's just the way you do things. So what is sort of like some sort of helpful frameworks to navigate through those like uncertain decisions?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I'll credit Ben because a lot of this thinking comes straight from Ben Horowitz. So there are fundamentally two personality types in every startup. There's the crazy originators of ideas who are always pushing people. They're very unreasonable. They're uncomfortable to be behind because nothing is good enough for them. They're the ones that come up with the ideas. So this is Steve Jobs. This is Bill Gates. Right? The other personality in a startup is let's get the trains to run on time. Let's scale this thing. This idea is working. Now we need to hire 1,000 people. Now we need to launch in 100 cities. They're not as creative on the product side, but they're very good at organizations and repeating things. You need to basically manage the yin-yang tension between the ones and the twos in the organization. You need to have enough crazy people who have enough rope to bring creativity, and then you need to have enough constraint on them to actually scale their good ideas. The problem with the number ones, the creatives, is they have too many ideas. That's their essential function. So you have a couple choices when you have too many ideas. You can either try to ramp them down and say, please don't have so many ideas, right? Or you surround them with number twos and tell the number ones, look, we can only implement some of these ideas. Not every one of these ideas is implementable at scale. And so you just need to sort of manage the tension between the creatives. And the magical thing about the creatives is they're extremely confident in an era, in a regime where there's very little data, right? And the number twos, they're sweating it. They're like, I need 1,000 more survey results. I need a lot more social validation before I'm willing to make that move. So the great startups are the ones started by ones who quickly realize they need twos in the company to help them make progress, and sort of managing that tension is sort of the secret to that.
So I want to dig into what you said about the crypto world and how you're investing in the lower tier part of it. It's very interesting because a company like Blockstack is considered sort of the DNS of crypto, but there are lots of higher tier companies. They say that the crypto version of LinkedIn, the crypto version of Facebook. In my opinion, it's a bit too early for these companies to exist because the processing power is not there. But what do you feel like is the time horizon for these sorts of companies to exist? And what needs to be done before they can be as populous as, say, a Facebook or a Airbnb?
Yeah, we agree with you that the consumer applications, right, the direct competitors to sort of Facebook and Airbnb and Lyft and Uber, it's not quite time yet. So maybe a year, maybe two. But think about all of the things that we needed to do with the original set of internet protocols before there was Netscape, right? So HTTP and HTML and FTP and all of this innovation. And it was basically the sum of all those protocols that made it possible, right? Even the very first version of Netscape, like if you typed FTP://, it did something. Gopher did something. Whois did something, right? There was a very rich set of protocols. Now, not all of them were useful, but a lot of them were useful. And so we're basically now investing in that layer, right? And we think there are going to be a set of things that need to be in place in the layers below. And there's a lot of turmoil and Wild West and crazy thinking there. I would say from a computer science point of view, we've got a lot of very good ideas. We know how to solve the Bitcoin energy consumption problem. We know how to get a distributed, untrusted network to actually verify transactions. We know all of these things, but putting the combinations of those things together, computer science plus game theory plus developer adoption, right? That's what it's going to make each one of these protocols successful, right? So the DNS, the identity, the naming, the addressing, the distributed computation, every one of those will get sort of layered brick by brick, and then the successful ones will attract a community. After that period, then we're ready for the applications on top. So the big question will be, if we make all the protocol developers rich, right, through ICOs or, sort of ICOs are kind of passé now, but like there will be another mechanism, how much is left over for the applications? So if you sort of think about the internet era, what happened was all the protocol designers got nothing, and all of the incredibly valuable companies, right? So think of GAFA, right? Google, Amazon, Facebook. They are all direct benefit, like Apple couldn't exist without TCP/IP. So they captured all of the value. What if we invert it and the protocol designers get 90%? Because that's part of what we're trying to design for, is to let protocol designers who are contributing massive amounts of intellectual property to create an ecosystem. What if only 10% is left over for the consumer apps? And that's sort of, it's too early to call, but it's certainly a possible outcome.
I'm curious about GitHub, because I'm sure we were all shocked when we saw the news, and it seems like quite a weird one, because a company with such a strong network felt like it would be one of the few to come out and keep going into that kind of next tier, maybe not as big as Microsoft, but remaining independent. What do you think that says about the long-term prospects of startups, to get all the way?
Yeah, if you think about every startup, the startup founder has a vision, right? And in the GitHub case, the vision was source control for everybody. Anybody who's working on software on a team, we want you to use Git. We want you to use GitHub as the repository for it. And then we start to use GitHub for not only storing code, but learning about people and followers and stars and forks. And so we built LinkedIn essentially for developers on top of GitHub. And so if that was the vision, which is I want that for the entire world, then it's just a question of, do I do that as an independent company, or do I do that as part of a combination? And look, founders agonize over this every day, every hour, right? Remember I talked about, we're going to rule the world. It's over. We'll never raise another money. And then we go have lunch, right? And this was the central question inside GitHub. And I have to say, Satya painted a very compelling vision of how he was going to leave them independent so that they could achieve their vision. And at one point they decided, look, if that's the vision, we can either try to do this alone, or we can do it with our friends at Microsoft and enjoy a longer time horizon, run more experiments rather than fewer on our way to get to that vision. And that's sort of the decision that they make. And look, these are hard decisions. Like, there's nothing more personal than that for a startup. And I hope one day everybody in this room gets to sort of face that difficult decision, which is, am I better off finding somebody who can give me a little more time, a little more stability, a little more cash, so that I can achieve my ultimate vision?
You went long on a few big incumbent companies. I was wondering if there were cases in recent years where you had gone against the grain, where companies have been hyped a lot by investors, and Andreessen Horowitz not followed that, and what the rationale was around that.
You know, a lot of our bets look like they were bets on massive incumbents with sort of no downside, but that's only after they got to an outcome. So when we invested in Skype, for instance, it came out that they did not own the intellectual property for their software, which is like, what's a software company got except it's intellectual property? And so like that looked like an extremely, extremely risky bet, even though they had a lot of users in a very loyal community. But you know, think about Skype at that time, which is, it was, you know, probably one of the most powerful companies in the ecosystem, but at the exact time when WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and all of these alternatives for connecting people were on the rise. And so it was not an obvious bet at all on at the time. And so these things sort of are very easy in retrospect to sort of look back on and say, well, of course Instagram was a bet. But the problem was Instagram was one of 100 or 1,000 people who were going to like, hey, if you have a camera in your pocket, you probably want to share those pictures with somebody. There were literally 1,000 of these, right? And so it is, you know, classic human thing, survivorship bias, right, is what we call this formally, is to look at the companies and say, well, of course, right? Like that was obvious, but they don't look obvious at the time. And in particular, at the prices that we're paying for them, right? The valuations that were set, it's very easy to sort of say, that was classic overpaying for a company that has no revenue, or a company that has very little DAO, or DAO over MAU, or whatever, you know, name your favorite metric. So most of these things only look sort of obvious in retrospect rather than when you're making the investment, because that's sort of a white knuckled, I can't believe we're paying that valuation conversation every time.